Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome back to my ongoing review series of Halo the Master Chief Collection. Previously I discussed the common gameplay elements that span the entire franchise, eschewing specifics like weapon and enemy variety in exchange for talking about the interface, common game modes, and some general criticism for the campaign across the board. Now we get to delve into those specifics, beginning with Halo Combat Evolved, the one that started it all. There's very little I could say to properly introduce this one, so let's jump straight into it, starting with the weapon variety. Up first is the Magnum, the first weapon you get access to, and your main weapon should you play the multiplayer or go any higher than normal mode in the campaign. The accuracy tends to fall off a bit from long range, but the fact that it can reliably headshot as one of the few weapons that can scope means it ends up being the most effective despite the existence of the assault rifle on the box art. And honestly, you'll end up dumping that assault rifle almost immediately. As while it's okay when you have nothing else, it's hard to compare to the weapons you get from the next room over. First up is the Plasma Pistol, which can fire a charged shot that immediately takes out enemy shields, with that charged shot also having a small homing component. Second, there's the Plasma Rifle, which isn't the most precise weapon, but is a nice complement to the Assault Rifle, with the former being more effective against shields, and the latter being more effective once the shields have been brought down and you're starting to chip their health away. Outside of that, you have the Needler, a weapon which is a lot of fun to use purely based on the sound effect as you see this stream of needles inch toward the enemy you're pointing at, and then watching them all explode in his face. Though it isn't as useful as the Magnum, the needles are homing to an extent, so as long as you're pointing at an enemy who isn't too far away, it's a solid weapon. If the enemy gets really close, however, that's when the shotgun comes out. Though it may not be great against shields and has a really short effective range, if you're able to get the jump on someone, they seldom have a chance to respond before they're seeing red. Just bear in mind that this weapon is the reason why a lot of people hate campers in this game, as if you're in close quarters with someone that has a shotgun, all it takes for them to kill you is a shotgun blast and then a punch to the face, which may be satisfying to pull off but isn't exactly fun to be on the receiving end of. The remaining weapons all tend to be fairly situational or rare, with a sniper rifle for long range, a rocket launcher for dealing with vehicles, a fuel rod gun that's basically the alien version of a rocket launcher, a flamethrower that I've only seen in large multiplayer maps where it's pretty much useless, and two types of grenades. The frag grenade can be bounced off of pretty much everything, be it walls, vehicles, other people, or anything else you can think of, and explodes shortly after it hits the ground. They generally can't kill a target on their own, but the fact that they explode shortly after hitting the ground means you can use them to finish an opponent off, flush them out of cover, or just make them panic. The plasma grenade sticks to floors, vehicles, and most importantly of all, people, which leads the player base to interchangeably call them sticky grenades. They tend to be more difficult to use as they take much longer to explode after touching something, meaning the only way you can reliably kill someone with them is if they somehow don't notice the glowing blue orb or the sound effect you hear as it's about to explode. That then means your main way of killing people with it is by sticking it to them, literally, at which point you get an in-game medal for being a badass. All of these specialized weapons tend to be fairly powerful, but are offset by being less common, and the fact that they can't hold very many rounds before you need to reload. Where vehicles are concerned, you have a couple different ones per faction. For human vehicles, you have the Warthog, a Jeep with a mounted machine gun as well as a shotgun seat who is able to shoot with whatever weapon he has equipped, with the driver only being able to drive. For large teams in multiplayer, and for when you have Marines joining you for single player, it has its use as a way to spray and pray at enemies. With how it controls though, it's pretty easy to flip over, a fact the game seems to recognize due to how easy they make it to flip back. So half the fun of the Warthog is just figuring out how to drive it properly without dumping out everyone who's in it. Luckily, regardless of how bad you are at the start, the Warthog is literally indestructible, which is offset by the fact that pretty much everyone on it is really easy to shoot out. For another fast-moving vehicle, you have the Ghost, an alien vehicle that can hold a single driver and has a pair of really inaccurate plasma rifles built into it. Like all of the vehicles, there's no need to worry about ammo, but unlike the Warthog, it will blow up if it gets hit enough, to offset the fact that it's really hard to shoot the driver out if you're attacking it from the front. Luckily, for larger maps, you'll have plenty of ways to take out any obnoxious ghost you see, as evidenced by the Scorpion tank. The main cannon leaves a pretty explosion every time it's used, and it also has a machine gun as a secondary weapon, which tends to not be very useful over long distances but can be effective if someone gets too close. However, in order for the tank to be balanced in multiplayer, it has one major weakness. While the tank itself may be indestructible, the driver's seat is very easy to hit with a precision weapon, meaning while you might see tanks a lot in larger maps, you won't see them used very often. as unless you can get the jump on your enemy or cover the window with the tank's main cannon, you are effectively a sitting duck. Still, if someone takes to the skies in a Banshee, an alien fighter that's basically an airborne version of the Ghost, it is pretty easy to take them out with a Scorpion. How you bring them down though varies between single player and multiplayer. As with the Ghost, they're destroyable in single player, but in multiplayer where they would otherwise blow up, they just fall to the ground and sit there, waiting to be used by their next hapless victim. Beyond that, there are a couple of things that enemies will have access to during the campaign that you simply don't. Among these is an energy sword that can one-shot you if the enemy wielding it gets too close, the fuel rod gun which you can only equip in multiplayer, and an alien tank which fires slow-moving projectiles that have a large arc and are generally easy to avoid, but will hurt a lot if you sit still too long. So after spending all this time talking about the weapons and vehicles, in case it hasn't been made clear yet, the weapons are really well balanced. With the exception of the assault rifle, every weapon has its own niche, and almost all of them are really satisfying to use as a result. The only problems you'll run into pertain to vehicles, as there are a couple of things you'll need to worry about. First up is the fact that compared to the other games, the vehicles are really floaty, to a degree where going from Combat Evolved to literally any of the future games is like having to completely relearn how to drive them. The part that's really frustrating though is the aim assist that's built into the weapons. With Halo originally releasing for consoles while simultaneously favoring precision accuracy, there's a couple of things the game does in order to ensure your hits find their mark. For controllers specifically, they'll move your camera a little for you until your crosshair is right over the enemy. It won't help you line up a headshot, but it does mean there's one less axis to worry about in case you're crazy enough to use a controller instead of a keyboard and mouse. On top of this, regardless of your control scheme, the spread on your weapon will tend to narrow on your opponent if you at least aim close enough to them already. This is especially noticeable with the plasma rifle, and while it might be okay in that circumstance, it's incredibly counterproductive when using vehicles. The worst case of this is with the Scorpion tank, as you would much prefer to have precise control over it so you can fire it behind cover or nail multiple enemies at once. But because of the shot's tendency to bend toward a target, it seemed like the crosshair was conspiring against me. I mean, I get that you need to make the console peasants feel better about their inferior control scheme, but surely I can be trusted to aim where I want my hits to land. Either way, where enemies are concerned, the Covenant are a rather diverse group of alien races, who for whatever reason took one look at humans and decided to kill every last one of them. The weakest enemies, and the ones you'll run into first, are the Grunts, who are small little beasties who don't pose much of a threat unless there's enough of them to make a wall of plasma shots, or if they have fuel rod guns. Even then though, they're a cowardly bunch who will run away when their friends get killed, so they're easy enough to deal with. Standing high and mighty above them are the elites. These guys are tall warriors armed with shields and plasma rifles, and are therefore much harder to kill unless you have a plasma pistol to drop their shields, or can land a sticky grenade on them. However, they also have a tendency to dive for cover when they see a grenade, so when they show up, they put up a solid fight. When you reach a more open area, you'll also encounter the Jackals, which have large energy shields that can take quite a few shots to remove, but if you can hit them in the hand, the pain will cause them to recoil, allowing you a moment to get a few more shots in and maybe even get a one shot to the head. It's a little difficult to hit them in the hand with the Magnum, so you can also use a charged plasma shot to take out the shield in one hit, at which point it becomes easier to knock them down. Alternatively, you can force them to move, either by taking cover to make them find a better angle, or throwing a grenade. Or if you're feeling really brave, you can walk up to them and punch them in the face enough until they finally give in. It's not the most advisable strategy ever, as there's no way to increase your movement speed in this game, and your punch can't guarantee a kill unless you hit the back of the neck, but if you reach the end of a magazine, it can be a useful way to finish them off. For heavy fire, you have the Hunters, which are hulking behemoths with tough armor, a variant on the fuel rod gun, and a large shield that seems to deflect your shots. The trick to killing these guys is to get close quarters with them, as while their swings can definitely hurt, they tend to overswing if you can sidestep a little bit, meaning you can put a single pistol round into their exposed back to take them out instantly. And it's thanks to that little trick that they went from the hardest enemy to the easiest once I hit the legendary mode, as even though the highest difficulty amps up the enemy's health and damage, apparently the one shot to the back still works just fine. There are a few other enemies as well, but to avoid spoilers I won't go into detail about them. All that matters is that one group is fairly easy to take down but tends to come in swarms, another is hard to kill with plasma weapons but get torn to shreds by the human weapons, with the shotgun being introduced when they show up, another should be avoided so that you don't get a ton of splash damage when they go down, and there's another on top of that which I daren't even vaguely hint to, but offers something fairly different once you get further in. Though this doesn't give you a large number of different enemies, each one has their own differences and how you can best take them out. Grunts offer decent interference in large enough numbers, elites are hard to take down without special tactics, jackals require effective aiming regardless of the weapon you're using, and hunters require careful timing to see that sweet spot and to utilize it, assuming you're not playing co-op and can just use your friend as bait. There's also a decent amount of variety within a given enemy type, such as with the elites. Some of them behave slightly differently, others are armed with a sword, still others may frustrate you by using a cloaking device, or maybe they'll have a cloaking device on top of the one-hit wonder to really make you hate your life. To be fair, the ones with cloaking devices use them at the expense of shields, so even your assault rifle can do a fair amount to them. But when your only clue of their existence is the small glow from their plasma rifles, it can be a little annoying when they show up, especially if there's more than one. There's one point in my legendary run where the game threw an entire room of them at me, and my solution for dealing with it was to basically run through it all, randomly throwing grenades to make them duck for cover, and then pretend like they didn't exist once I got out of the room. And to add even more variety, the enemies will also react whenever you do things like throw a grenade or catch them by surprise, which is an amusing detail that makes it even more fun to nail them with a sticky grenade. That being said, while the weapon and enemy variety are in good shape, there are two places where the campaign is noticeably weaker. The first part is with respect to my general complaint, the concerns about game balance. With this being the first game ever released, it suffers the most in this regard, as with how basic the core gameplay loop is, it's very easy to end up in a situation where you're trying to figure out how best to handle the wall of bullets that emerge whenever you step out of cover, especially if you're unlucky enough to not have a good weapon for the situation. This is especially the case in Legendary mode, where it seems like the only viable option to deal with most rooms is to either be really good at landing plasma grenades, or to use a plasma pistol to take out shields and the magnum to headshot. And honestly, I'm kinda surprised how well it worked after I got into a routine, as while there were still plenty of moments where I was repeating the same section over and over, to where the game took me almost 15 hours instead of 10 for my first ever heroic playthrough, the ammo I needed was pretty well spaced. Pretty much every time I was running low on magnum ammo, there was usually a conveniently dead bunch of marines who had all the ammo I would need for the next group, assuming I was careful with how much ammo I used. I couldn't keep the strategy going indefinitely, especially once I got to the midpoint and the mixture of enemies led weapons to be more situational, but it was nice to see that ammo and health pickups were set up pretty sensibly. However, while I've talked a decent amount about that point already, my second issue is the campaign's Achilles heel, the level design. To put it bluntly, it ranges from decent to abysmal. The place where it's at its best is the second mission, in which you're trying to rally multiple groups of marines who landed nearby. The circumstances are fairly similar throughout, as they have you find an area, defend it for a while, and then move on to the next, but because the locations are varied enough, no two defense points feel the same, and it's a solid level because of that. Where it really suffers is with respect to the indoor areas, because to put it simply, I hope you like hallways, because I got some hallways, a side of hallways, and for the cherry on top, yet more stupid hallways. For every interesting thing the level design sets up, it also throws in 5 more of the same looking corridors with the same looking textures and maybe a simple variation on enemies we've already seen before. Sure, the weapons are able to give you some variety, at least until you're playing Legendary mode and are forced to use the only viable weapon set, but given the small number of enemy types, there isn't a whole lot of variation from hallway to hallway. It ends up being so repetitive that one of the levels literally puts arrows on the ground to let you know that yes, this is the way forward, you didn't just backtrack. Which is a shame because halfway through the game they managed to throw a curveball with their story and significantly shake up the gameplay at the same time. But then after you've been in that situation for half an hour, the sense of dread that was created ends up replaced by a sense of annoyance that you still haven't reached the end of the identical looking corridors. And even when you get out of it, you get dragged off by what must have been the inspiration for Wheatley from Portal 2, only to get thrown into, you guessed it, more repetitive hallways. Only this time the enemy variety isn't nearly as good in what is one of, if not the most infamous levels in the franchise's history. There are so many repeated areas that you could shave 3 hours off the campaign's runtime and no one would notice. And before too many people get mad at me for saying this, I can already hear one of the major rebuttals, where people say, yeah, it was really basic back then, but it was a different time. And technically speaking, you are correct. It was the first time a shooter had made such an impact on the console market. And in service to my argument, it was a time when Valve actually made video games that weren't either niche or garbage. In fact, just 3 years prior to the release of Halo Combat Evolved, there was this little known game called Half-Life, which was a single-player FPS that was also revolutionary thanks to its novel approach to level design. and on the back of that level design, it's a game which still holds up to this day. Both of the games face similar limitations, as their stories were confined to a relatively small part of the world, meaning you would end up seeing a lot of the same texture work. One of these games made the most of it by constantly varying the layout of enemies, ammo, hazards, color schemes, and places where you can take cover to where across the entire game, there aren't that many direct patterns that can be drawn. The other is Halo Combat Evolved. I know the comparison isn't an exact one, as Half-Life was designed as purely a single-player FPS and was therefore balanced accordingly, but the point in bringing this up is that even for its time, it should have been possible to avoid just showing us the same identical hallways with slightly different enemies for this one in particular. So with all of the bashing I can dish out to the single-player campaign, clearly I've got plenty of positive things to say about the multiplayer, right? I spent a great deal of time talking about the weapon variety and how each one has its own purpose unless it's named the assault rifle, so clearly I'll love the multiplayer, right? Well, irrespective of my opinion, if you wish to try this game's multiplayer component out, it's not the most popular one. As while Combat Evolved was the first to release initially, the first game released for the Master Chief Collection onto PC was Reach. That then meant everyone got used to the many quality of life improvements that had been made in Reach, such as pointing the camera at the person who took you out, which meant the first game's multiplayer had the usual influx you get when it was first released, and then most people who played regularly just went back to Reach. Because of that, after the initial wave of enthusiasm, it wasn't until crossplay between Xbox and PC was introduced that I could reliably find 8v8 matches. I could still find 4v4s, but it meant I basically saw nothing of Blood Gulch for literal months. That being said, there is something chaotically fun about it. With how simple the graphics and map design are, there's very little subtlety to playing it, meaning the focus remains on how quickly you can take an enemy out without too much in the way of fanfare. However, with this being a much older game, the spawns ranged from odd to stupid, as there were multiple moments where I got killed almost immediately without having a chance to respond, simply because the game spawned me in the middle of the enemy team or out in the open where a stray sniper could easily pick me off. Add on to the fact that it's very easy to get sniper rifles in multiplayer, and there were a lot of moments where I would die and have no idea where the hits came from, a fact that was only partially helped as I learned the maps. Luckily, this usually only applied to Slayer, with the best comparison I have being on Blood Gulch. In Team Slayer, it's likely that you can end up spawning in the middle of a firefight, and end up immediately taken out by someone with a well-aimed pistol without the camera even giving you an idea as to which direction the bullets came from. For King of the Hill, you have a similar problem, but because everyone is focused on the points in the center of the map, it's not as severe. And where Capture the Flag is concerned, you consistently spawn in your own base instead of the enemies, which means the issue seldom if ever shows up there, and all you're left with is to simply wonder why we're here. It is one of life's great mysteries after all. Beyond that, the weapon variety from the campaign is technically present, but because you're not likely to run out of ammo, you'll find yourself consistently using the Magnum and Sniper Rifle, with maybe the shotgun for close quarters and some explosives thrown in for good measure. As I said when I first reviewed this game, because you can be far more precise with the keyboard and mouse, any use the assault rifle may have had as a spray and pray weapon is technically outmoded by the pistol's ability to headshot. And while it works fine if you have literally nothing else, it really is the weapon of last resort. Even so, if you do wish to try the multiplayer route, it seems like this was the game that really sold people on the 4v4 mode, because it's Combat Evolved multiplayer at its best. The maps are generally smaller, but since there's less cases where you end up spawned in the middle of the enemy team, there's usually enough people playing to where you can find a game if you explicitly look for it. And with how simple the core gameplay is, it's a lot of chaotic fun to just outgun and outgrenade your opponents. If you're looking for an objective-based game mode, then 8v8 is probably a better bet, though even at peak times the wait may be longer than you can stomach, especially if you're using input-based matchmaking. Part of the reason for this is because matchmaking can choose some rather interesting maps if you pick 8v8. As while it makes sense to have an 8v8 Slayer on Blood Gulch or Sidewinder, matchmaking will also throw you into this map, which, to put it mildly, does not work for that number of players. I'll grant you that even before it showed up in Combat Evolved, I was already biased against this map, as when it showed up in Reach, I didn't like it there either. Perhaps it was because it was sending me there for 8v8 matches as well, but it seemed to greatly reward people for channeling their inner Obi-Wan by going to one of the corners and using the courtyard for target practice. To add further insult to injury, since the game won't respawn you on that high ground if the enemy is already up there, it felt like the only reason it was halfway tolerable was because at least Sprint allowed you to get the hell out of dodge faster, though Sprint comes with its own can of worms that we'll be discussing later. Where Combat Evolved is concerned, the problem is even worse, as when you take away Sprint and have to spend 2 seconds switching from your assault rifle to the Magnum, You get a jumbled mess which I suspect turned off a lot of people who would have otherwise had quite a bit of fun trying out Team Slayer in the larger maps, as everyone dies a hell of a lot faster, and you barely have a chance to fight back before your body hits the floor. They are sensible enough to keep some of the smaller maps to their own section, but I suspect cases like this soured a lot of people to the larger game modes. Here's hoping the custom game browser can help alleviate this once it's ready. And finally, there's one last thing I've yet to discuss, specifically the graphics. With how old the game is, the models are definitely dated, and the simple nature of the levels show that age even more, but as with the multiplayer, there's something strangely pure about it, as they make sure to differentiate the enemies and weapons well enough to where everything is crystal clear. And with how ridiculous the spawns are, it's equal parts frustrating and fun as you're almost always flung back into the action either in the middle of it or right on the edge, which means for better or worse, there's never a dull moment. I make a point in specifying the graphics because, based on some of the footage I've been using, you may be thinking I was showing the wrong game. The reason for this is because back in 2011, an Anniversary Edition was released which revamped the graphics and sound design. It was and still is possible to switch back and forth by using the multiplayer scoreboard button, with the exception of cutscenes, and at first you might think these graphical improvements would be welcome, as relative to the original ones they are a technical improvement. However, there are a couple of drawbacks. First off, it's not possible to dynamically switch back and forth between the sound assets, and the only way to hear the originals is to specify them in Mission Select. I can understand not giving us the option in Quick Start, as in that case you want to just jump in and start playing without any fuss. However, to not have the option for playlists is a major oversight, especially considering there's already a place you could put it that would be consistent with the Mission Select's UI. Second, the improved graphics might make the game look more up to par with what we have now, but considering that it's 2011 graphics instead of 2001 graphics, it still looks fairly dated, with the screen being needlessly cluttered. Where the cutscenes are concerned, I suspect they were doing their best to show how much of an improvement there was on a technical level. But because they were confined to the character's original position, they added in too much movement within that limited range to where it hit the uncanny valley. As for the gameplay, the primary problem relates to the lighting, which is a lot more variable than before. This then means it's easier for enemies to hide in dark places, and while you do have a flashlight, there are points where you can see the enemy in the base graphics but can't in the Anniversary Editions. Regardless, if you want to play this in multiplayer, you do have the choice on whether to use classic or anniversary sound effects, but all of the graphics remain in classic mode, which I personally prefer. But if you like the increased graphical fidelity of the campaign, that is sadly the only place you're getting it. Also bear in mind that when Halo 3 released onto PC, they also introduced cosmetics that weren't present in the original game, and are focused on making your weapons, vehicles, and helmet visor look different. I personally like their inclusion, as while they might not necessarily fit with the original look, the arcadey nature of the game due to its older graphics help the weapons and vehicles to stand out even more than they did before. That being said, if you prefer the original look to stay the original look, there is an option to disable them, which means there's no obligation to look at what 343 has wrought if you don't want to. So with all of this being said, I'm really torn on whether to recommend this on its own or not. The story was worth it for me, but as someone who loves single-player FPS, Combat Evolved ended up feeling lacking in hindsight, even when compared to the FPS of its day. The enemy and weapon variety are solid, but with how the game is balanced to accommodate multiplayer, and with how repetitive the level design is, it's got a few neat tricks that are worth the price of admission, but otherwise you're likely to play it once so you can see how the story plays out and then never touch it again. Whether you end up enjoying it long term will likely boil down to the multiplayer as a result, and if you can find a game for it, there's just enough chaotic fun within 4v4 Slayer and 8v8 objectives to be interesting, even if you usually have to explicitly search for it in order to get a match. Even then though, if it's not your first experience of Halo multiplayer, it probably won't have the same longevity as the other games, so while it might be a neat distraction for a while, your attention will likely end up focused on the rest of the games instead. And it is there that we shall leave this discussion for another time. So with that being said, thank you all for watching. This may have been the first of the games, and therefore the simplest, but since this is the first time we're looking at the weapons and enemies, I suspect we're going to see similar video lengths for the remaining gameplay sections. And in a strange way, it's kinda nice to revisit this game, as I had reviewed Combat Evolved a few years ago, and it's interesting to see how my opinion has changed, and to see how much or how little was repeated from there. It won't be the last we speak of it, as there's still the story section to worry about, but next up will be the gameplay section for Halo 2. So if you liked what you saw, please consider liking and sharing this video, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all then.